Continuing education knows that at the end of the day, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we really listen to their needs, and we can offer them flexible options both within continuing education and across the campus.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the 78th Conference on World Affairs. My name is Xander Schulp. I am a senior here at CU studying economics and international affairs. I am also the program co-chair, student program co-chair for the conference, and I will be serving as today's moderator. For recording purposes, today's date is Thursday, April 16th, 2026. The time is 2 p.m., and this is the panel, Buying Up the Board. Are we in a game of Monopoly? Now, before we get started, I would like to read the University of Colorado Boulder's land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of the indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, faculty, and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Thank you. Once again, welcome to CWA and today's discussion. We ask that all attendees remain respectful throughout the discussion and refrain from interruptions. Signs, banners, noisemakers, and other audible disruptions are not permitted and will result in those responsible being asked to leave the room. Please silence your phones. Time will be allotted for questions from our in-person audience. We will take your questions via handwritten note cards. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and one of our producers will bring you a note card and a pencil. Please print legibly, then raise your hand when you have a completed card, and they will bring it to me. Over the past few years, scrutiny of large firms has intensified, from big tech platforms to major mergers. Consumers are increasingly frustrated with perceived market power in areas like concert ticketing, digital platforms, and even groceries. At the same time, these companies often deliver lower prices, greater convenience, and global scale. Given this tension and a shifting regulatory environment, we'll explore where the line is between healthy competition and excessive concentration. I'll ask that first, starting with Ellen, each of our panelists introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll get into some questions.
Thank you, Xander. My name's Ellen Weintraub. It's a pleasure to be here again with you all at CWA. Always a really delightful experience where I get to meet with so many interesting people. I served for many years on the Federal Election Commission, was elected chair for the year 2025, and then was fired by the president.
Hard to follow that. I'm Carl Quintanilla. I'm an anchor at CNBC, where I've been with them and NBC News for 20 some odd years. Prior to that, I was a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, where I covered some industries that we might talk about today, like airlines and capital goods. And prior to that, I was a student at the University of Colorado at Boulder.
Hey everyone, great to see turnout for this terrific panel, great topic. I'm Diana Moss. I'm a vice president and director of the Competition Policy Program at the Progressive Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. We are a center-left think tank that works towards pragmatic solutions to help working class families. I spend all my time every day breathing and living antitrust enforcement, and we'll be talking about that today.
Hi, my name is Tamar Greenstreet. I'm a sophomore studying accounting and finance, and I am I'm one of the student executives in CWA. My relevance to this panel is I am going into the field of investment banking. I will be heading to Bank of America in New York.
Thank you. Diana, to start, could you please briefly explain why competition matters for consumers and define a few terms that we'll use in this discussion?
Sure. So competition does matter. We live in a market-based economy, right? Markets are wonderful things. They bring together different participants to produce and intermediate and sell goods and services. Markets work really well when there's a lot of competition, when everyone's duking it out to be better than their rivals. Having a rival breathing down your neck, producing better products, being more innovative, better business model, lower cost resources, really keeps firms on their toes. When we lose competition and we have increased concentration in markets, meaning just a few firms control the market and the output of the market, we start getting into rough territory. Things like higher prices to consumers, lower wages to workers, lower quality products and services. Not so much incentive to innovate and really steam along and produce better products and better business models. So markets are great. They don't completely self-regulate. Some people think they do, and those are the anti-antitrusters. Keep government out of the markets. Well, when you have dominant players in markets like a Live Nation Ticketmaster or United Healthcare, when you have just a few firms controlling the market in what we call an oligopoly, a tight oligopoly, there aren't very strong incentives to compete hard, right? There's incentives to raise prices and to degrade quality and to slow down innovation. So we got to have some refs on the field, and the refs are the antitrust enforcers, and we have that at the federal level, right? And we have it at the state level. Our state AGs, our attorneys general, take care of that. I spend a lot of time talking to state AGs and to federal enforcers and to members of Congress and state legislators about the importance of antitrust enforcement. So I think we're going to have a debate here today about, well, is big is bad? Is big bad? And why? And what should we do? What are some of the demarcation lines in terms of how aggressively we should be pushing our policy levers to make sure our markets are competitive and that consumers benefit and innovation benefits and workers benefit?
Carl, in your conversations with CEOs and investors, how are companies actually reacting to the current antitrust environment, and are they changing the way they approach things like mergers?
They're giddy. They're doing a little happy dance. We're definitely in a period where the pendulum has swung, and we're in an administration that is openly advocating for a deregulatory environment and allowing for more mergers and acquisitions. And it's funny, we have I'm sort of bringing, I guess, Wall Street's point of view, just from it's what I cover, but we do have a hedge fund manager who comes on our show a lot named Mario Gabelli, who's famous for advocating for mergers. His self-anointed nickname is Dr. Love, because he'll come on the show with a list of companies that he thinks should buy another company, and all these would-be combinations, and he calls it his proselytizing for corporate lovemaking in his view. But there is a view that, even going back, and I'm not going to try to outdo the lawyer, but even the original Sherman Act doesn't necessarily say monopolies are bad in themselves. There are coercive monopolies and innocent monopolies. And we can think of lots of examples right now, the street would argue, where a corporate giant brings value. Countries would love to have our tech giants. China would love to have an Apple. They'd love to have an NVIDIA. There are good examples of them supporting our economy through investment and CapEx. Anybody who's following data center, that's a huge, portion of our gross domestic product. And I think there are good examples of giants who are kind of having their heels nipped at. Apple can have whatever it wants, essentially, given its balance sheet, but it's in a dogfight in the digital music business with Spotify. I live in Manhattan, and every morning I have some blackberries with yogurt for breakfast, and the grocery store across my street is like it's $6, $7 for a little box of blackberries. On Amazon, it's $3. Here's a corporate giant that I guess if they wanted to could put the squeeze on consumers, but given their scale and their ability to leverage their volume, they are bringing discounts. And that's not to say they haven't done a huge amount of destruction to mom and pop businesses, which is terrible, but it's not truly clarified, this notion that because you're big or your market share is over 50%, that you are a bad actor.
Thank you, Carl. Ellen, to what extent are policymakers under pressure to not act aggressively on antitrust? And what does that pressure look like?
Well, I am not an antitrust person, but I am a money and politics person, and there's a whole lot of money in politics from big business. So in 2024, the top 6 donors each gave more than $100 million. One gave close to $300 million. We know who that is. His name is Elon Musk. The top 45 donors each gave more than $10 million. The top 100 donors each gave more than $3.7 million. And fun fact, numbers 99 and 100 are the Winklevoss twins, in case anybody wants to know. New York Times just recently did an analysis where they found that 300 billionaires and their immediate family members donated more than $3 billion, 19% of all contributions in federal elections in 2024, either directly or through political action committees. And a couple of industries that have been very active. I mean, historically, the realtors, which is composed of, all these little mom and pop shops around the country, have a huge trade association, huge PAC. But, more recently, we're seeing the crypto industry, which only in the last few election cycles got heavily involved in politics, and the top tech companies that have an interest in AI also have huge super PACs. So both the crypto industry and the AI industry have these big super PACs, and they are not being shy about going around and trying to muscle politicians and make it clear that they will spend heavily in order to ensure that only politicians who make commitments not to regulate them will get elected. Now, that doesn't always work. Now, there are politicians who are intimidated by the size of the amount of money that these guys can spend, but when you look at the actual election results, person who raises or spends the most money does not always win. And sometimes when it looks like some big gun is coming in there to try and muscle their way, particularly into a local election, the voters sometimes rebel. We saw that, for example, in a Wisconsin judicial race a couple of cycles ago, where the fact that Elon Musk came in and dropped, I think, about $10 million actually persuaded more people to vote against the candidate that he was supporting. So money doesn't always work, but it is something that I can tell you that every single politician is very aware of, and I think that it is part of the reason why we don't have right now any comprehensive effort at AI regulation. I think the crypto issue is a little bit complicated by the president's stand on crypto and his personal benefit from the crypto industry. But certainly the AI industry is trying to intimidate people from regulating. And so far they've been pretty successful at the federal level, not at the state level. There's a number of states that have adopted laws.
Thank you, Ellen. Tomorrow you're planning on going into investment banking. Can you explain to the audience what the industry is like and how antitrust policy plays a role there?
Yes, so for anyone who does not know what investment banking is, we are essentially the realtors of big business. So that is when you hear about a merger or an acquisition, or someone is raising money, or they are going onto the public stock market. It is the role of an investment bank to essentially be the advisor of all of these companies to tell them what is the best possible way to do that. That is going to be your Goldman Sachs, your Bank of America, your JP Morgan. Every big bank is essentially making a fee off of these transactions. What that means, especially in mergers and acquisitions, is if that deal isn't going to go through, they're not going to make that transaction fee. So what really happens in my industry is when those deals go through, there is some type of profit that that investment bank is going to make, and otherwise those kind of fees are not going to be eligible for them.
Diana, yesterday a jury found that Ticketmaster and Live Nation have an anti-competitive monopoly. What actually changes for consumers when they're punished? Do we expect lower prices, better access, or is it just a similar structure, a different structure with similar outcomes?
Yeah, Live Nation Ticketmaster is a really great case study. Comes along at a time when American consumers and workers are struggling really fundamentally with high concentration in labor markets and in major markets that contribute to big consumer spending: housing, food, healthcare, energy. So entertainment is a multi-billion-dollar market. Carl would know this for sure, but $26 billion in 2026. So the Live Nation case was brought by the U.S. Department of Justice under the Biden administration. It was a transition case that transitioned from Biden to the Trump administration. It had an unprecedented number of states signing on to the case. So 40 states and the District of Columbia signed on. So when the states sign on to a federal complaint, that tells you something. It tells you that everybody's pretty darn concerned. And so, the short answer is Live Nation Ticketmaster merged in 2010. That was an illegal merger that was allowed through with some pretty weak, ineffective conditions, which they immediately began to violate. And the problem is this: for larger kind of venues, they are threatened and harassed by Live Nation Ticketmaster to sign contracts, exclusive contracts, to only use Ticketmaster. Only use Ticketmaster. So, these independent venues, and they're all over, you've all been to them in Colorado and elsewhere, are railroaded into only using Ticketmaster. That protects Ticketmaster's monopoly, right? And allows them to raise prices not only for tickets, but really in the fees. It's the ticket fees. You see those fees when you're online trying to buy tickets, and you're like, wow, the fees are double the price of the tickets. So a jury, very unusual to have a jury trial in a big antitrust case, but the Biden DOJ did that on purpose. It was a strategic decision to get 12 jurors up there to render a decision, a verdict, on whether Live Nation Ticketmaster has violated antitrust law. And that would be the Sherman Act, Section 2, the monopolization statute. And so that's a powerful message to the American public that violating antitrust law hurts competition, it hurts our markets, and it hurts consumers. And in this case, it also hurt artists, because artists are affected by this. It also hurts small businesses in the live event supply chain, like smaller concert promoters, artist management companies. So really, really interesting case. The problem with the case is the Trump administration decided to intervene. The White House decided to intervene, struck a big settlement with Live Nation Ticketmaster before the case went to trial. Before the case went to trial. I'll repeat that. Okay, so the states knew nothing of what was going on. They were cut out of this whole process, and the states got really angry, and the judge got really angry, and the state said, you know what, we're going to keep going. We're going to go to trial, and we're going to have a jury trial, and we're going to get a verdict. Meanwhile, the Trump administration, in a blatantly corrupt move, struck this sweetheart settlement with Live Nation Ticketmaster, which does absolutely nothing to rein in their market power. So now we have this showdown, right, between the states getting damages for the monopoly overcharges, and what will happen on the federal side with this spineless, toothless sham settlement that the Trump administration has negotiated with the company. So this jury verdict really puts a big, big exclamation point on a finding that a very large, durable monopoly in the U.S. has been found guilty of an antitrust crime. And they are crimes. It's not a criminal offense, it's a civil offense, but it affects millions and millions of music fans and consumers and artists and other businesses.
And what would potentially change should all of these deals be regulated properly?
So the short answer is the hope was if the DOJ had not intervened in a corrupt way and violated due process and compromised the rule of law, we would have gotten a breakup remedy, right? Live Nation and Ticketmaster would have been unscrambled, right? They would have had to sell off Ticketmaster to operate independently without having the incentives from the concert promotion side of the business, infect the ticketing side of the business. And in fact, Ticketmaster may have been broken up into little Ticketmasters, just like we did with AT&T in 1984. Remember that? Where we got the baby bells, the 7 baby bells? That was the hope. That all went down the drain with this sham settlement that the Trump administration negotiated. So that would have been amazing, a breakup. It would have injected, like on steroids, competition into the ticketing market. Prices would have gone down, ticket fees would have gone down, consumers would have benefited, artists would have benefited, and really all we have now is what the states can get in terms of damages for all of their consumers, right? The overcharges that they paid, the monopoly overcharges. So this is, I would call this almost a miscarriage of justice on the federal side because of political interference in this really large, seminal, landmark antitrust case. If it had gone well and we got in a breakup, boy, would that have set some really good precedent moving forward for other monopolization cases that the government would have brought and felt more confident bringing in these really important markets that consumers are in a lot.
Thank you, Diana. What role does precedent play then, generally, in terms of how much of an impact are those past cases going to inform the general environment and the way companies approach mergers?
That's still for me.
Anyone can take that one.
No. I'm not going to take the legal stuff.
Well, Carl, I'd love to hear your perspective on that. Like, not the legal perspective, but how you talked about companies are giddy.
Well, I mean, this is one extremely important case to the street. The other is Google, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point. But similarly in Google, where also you had 38 states join the DOJ in their complaint. The idea was that Google was a monopoly in search and text advertising, and that they illegally used their market power. They had all these exclusive arrangements with T-Mobile and AT&T and Verizon, where if you make us your default search engine, we'll give you a cut of the revenue, right? Which kept competitors from entering the market and efficiently playing along. And the street was bracing for Judge Mehta of the DC Circuit to make them sell Chrome, which is their web browser, and it didn't happen. Well, this huge almost a 300-page decision, arguing that Google did in fact violate Section 2 of Sherman, but that you didn't have to sell. Didn't have to sell Chrome, and the street was a huge sigh of relief for Wall Street. The bar for breakup is very high. It's extremely high, I think.
Hey, Xander, can I pop in here with a question? Because I'm really curious about this. I spend a lot of my time encouraging enforcers to focus on consumer-facing markets and worker-facing markets, right? The antitrust agencies, state, federal, they only have so many resources to go around, and they're very scarce resources. They have to pick their cases really carefully. It's not like, oh, we can pursue every case that comes along. So my question is, Carl tees up a really good dichotomy between this Google monopolization case and this Live Nation Ticketmaster monopolization case. Prices really aren't, from the consumer perspective, aren't a factor in Google. You're not paying dollars to get on the Google search engine. What are you paying with? You're paying with your clicks and your personal information. These are what we call non-price markets, zero-price markets. So do we want to allocate more? Do we want to make choices about allocating our scarce, valuable antitrust enforcement resources to markets that are more consumer-facing than, say, digital markets? Or do we want to allocate them towards Live Nation Ticketmaster, where you are paying monopoly fees, for sure? How about blocking the Kroger-Albertsons merger, which was a huge victory for the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission? That would have been, man, if you wanted to see your grocery prices go up, that merger would have done it for you. So it's a question, and maybe Ellen and Tamar have comments on this. When you have scarce government resources, how do you allocate them in ways that are going to really protect markets that we care about?
I'll just hop onto that really quick and argue that a lot of this is a function of like political will. I mean, no one likes concert ticket. No one likes that business model. None of us like that business model. And so I think there was a lot of energy behind that complaint. Tech companies aren't necessarily popular, but their products are popular. Like the iPhone is popular. Instagram is popular. Spotify is popular. So it takes a lot of energy to get state AGs to spend their political capital on. They can only file a few of these big things, per year. Airlines is a great example. No one thinks that there's a rumor on the street this week that United kind of wants to buy American. And no one believes that having 3 majors instead of 4 majors is going to help airfares. So there's a ton of skepticism that could ever clear, even in this very friendly, business-friendly administration.
Ellen, Tamara, anything to add or to respond to Diana's question?
I mean, I can only respond in a sort of a generic way. It's somebody who used to be in government, and we used to have to make, in an enforcement agency, and we used to have to make, set priorities as to where we were going to deploy the agency resources because we didn't have enough. And on a good day, that meant that we would prioritize the most important cases, the ones that would have the biggest impact, or the most egregious violators. But there were internal politics at play in that context as well. And I don't know that affects the, it was perhaps less direct, but there was no question that some of the commissioners had a more pro-business tilt and were, definitely on the less regulatory side. So, we had an evenly divided commission, and we had to set regulatory and enforcement priorities. In the FTC and in virtually every other government agency, the administration controls. So they set the priorities for the agency, and you hope that they're going to be acting in the best interests of the most people. But sometimes one wonders if that's actually what their motivation is.
Can I just follow up on that? Because Ellen's making a really important point about agency resources and prioritization. But right now, everything's on steroids. We have gone past the question of, yes, administrations do set general priorities for enforcement under their watch. We have gone from that to the White House directly getting involved in antitrust cases. All right, so that should scare the crap out of everybody. That is a violation of due process, and that challenges the rule of law in our legal system. So, for example, if American and United want to merge and create an airline that's going to have about 50% market share in the domestic passenger airline market, their first stop was the White House. It wasn't the DOJ to talk to the front office, the Assistant Attorney General, about their deal. It was the White House. In the Nexstar-Tegna merger, which we talked about on another panel 2 days ago, Brendan Carr, who's the chair of the FCC, single-handedly lifted the national audience reach cap to let that deal through. The cap is 39% of the national audience. He lifted it to 80%, single-handedly, unilaterally. So, I could go on and on with examples, I'm sure. But I just want to put the exclamation point on Ellen's comment that, yes, administrations do shape the priorities of their executive agencies, but we are in uncharted territory here with Trump, and it is really, really scary. And because it's antitrust, it will touch the lives and the pocketbooks and the paychecks of every single American in this country. It already has.
And he's also, the president's also intervening on the back end of prosecutions, pardoning people whose relatives make large campaign contributions to his PACs. The wielding of the pardon power after the fact has been, I think, has incredibly undermined the rule of law.
So we'll go to some audience questions here. Isn't market concentration a feature of capitalism, not a bug? And don't the incentives of capitalism ensure we end up with oligopolies or monopolies like the automobile industry? And maybe speak about how sometimes the prices for things like private label goods can be cheaper and that vertical integration will lead to lower prices, but is that always good for the consumer in the long run?
I mean, I think I can talk. I think Apple is a great example here, is they own most of their supply chain. And so that new $500 computer that they just came out with, this is a great example of they could not do that in a way without owning that supply chain. So some of the products we're getting, in my opinion, and I think everyone else can speak to this, like you're getting a better product because they can own every step and they're not getting charged a premium. But to what degree does owning every step kind of help them or not help the world around them?
I do think companies are being protected not just by the weaponization of policy that we've seen and talked about just now, but thinking big picture, the economy is getting very efficient and very dynamic. Just think about what we've been through in the last 45 days with these hostilities and the broken supply chains and oil going to Brent going to 140. The stock market's up from that moment. And that's the market sniffing out an economy that has survived COVID and the great financial crisis and dot-com booms. And yes, there was rescues and bailouts in there, but all these companies, I'm talking large public companies, all their executives and their teams have been formed by those crucibles, and they're now just extremely smart about risk. There's a great piece in the Times this week about, I think the quote was, they've become ninjas on risk management. They're that good. I mean, they're better than any other country's companies in the world. So that allows them productivity, efficiency, and there's this cloak of dynamism in the economy that I think protects this idea. Oh well, if they get too big, they're gonna screw us. So that's one thing. The other is that there's a lot of small business formation in this country. I don't know if you know anybody who has started their own business, but that's another thing that came out of COVID. People realized, I want to work from home. I want to have my own thing. You can't rely on big companies to be loyal. So like small business formation is at record highs. And especially in industries that they call growth industries, like professional services and technology, as opposed to value companies like real estate. But it's still happening. So even though we're talking about all these giants overwhelming commerce, there's this entire bed of new pop-up startups. I talk to these guys every day, and they all want to come on the show because they want to grow their business and reach an investor base and raise capital and maybe one day go public. So it's not like there's no competition being formed in the brush. That's all happening at scale, and it does keep the big companies on their toes.
So, in the kind of environment of startups and innovation, could strict antitrust policy potentially be a barrier to that in terms of, especially with the expectation for a lot of startups, with the end game being acquisition? Does that potentially lead to slower innovation and incentives there?
I'm happy to take this one, having spent a lot of time on this very question. Carl's absolutely right, and it's an important factoid that small business accounts for an enormous part of economic growth in this country. And so we want to promote that. We want to protect that. We want to promote it. And as an economist, what I would say, of course, is we want to use antitrust enforcement and competition policy to keep the entry barriers low, right? Think about a small business, and there's a big dominant firm sitting out there, the 800-pound gorilla, and it's like they're looking at a big castle and trying to get over the castle walls and across the moat so they can get to the market and get a foothold in the market. That's the biggest risk to small businesses, is that they're just going to get iced out by some anti-competitive strategy that the dominant firm is gonna engage in, right? So we want to do some issue spotting and case spotting on the enforcement front to make sure we keep those barriers low, flag harmful behavior, anti-competitive behavior by firms that really jeopardize small business. But to your really good point, Xander, about, well, should antitrust be deferential to the business model of, say, the VC-funded startup in Silicon Valley? The answer, and this is just fact, is that antitrust does not defer at all to business models. So just because the big five tech started largely through this VC-funded model of nurturing, incubating small businesses, and then they would buy them or they would go IPO. whatever. It doesn't matter that that's a great golden, what's the term, the goose that laid the golden egg? It doesn't matter. Antitrust is out there to protect competition. Doesn't matter what the business model looks like. And you can agree with that or you can disagree with that. But that is the stance that antitrust has taken.
There's also, there is also this, going back to like Ayn Rand and Alan Greenspan, this objectivist sort of view, I think they call it radical capitalism, that any antitrust is an immoral choice. That I think Greenspan had the line where we'll never know, it's something like, we'll never know how many products or services died before they could be born because of antitrust regulation, and we'll never be able to compute the cost to society by those ideas that never got formed. So that's extreme, and it's completely separate from the sort of personalization of Washington that we see under Trump.
I just want to note for the record, because the arguments for higher levels of concentration in terms of spurring more innovation, better business models, more product development, those sound good. We have a lot of economic evidence on that in my business. But I will say this: the Harvard Business School has done a cajillion studies on whether M&A, mergers and acquisitions, have been successful. A lot of economic studies on this. There's just a boatload of evidence out there on past consolidation. And, it's not a great scorecard. A lot of mergers just don't deliver the goods. They don't deliver the value. It's hard to integrate big companies, right? A lot of you out there who are in business have been through some integrations where your company bought another company and all the managers had to get together and figure out how to make this work. The scorecard's not great. In terms of creating value. In fact, a lot of studies find value's been destroyed by heavy, ill-conceived mergers.
That's whenever a deal gets announced and the CEOs come on to sell it on the show, one of the second or third question is always about execution and whether or not you can merge. Like banking's a classic example. I don't know if you've ever worked at a big company where, as Diana said, I'm just thinking of Wells Fargo, for example, which is the airlines. American bought US Air. Anyway, yes. And all the little, it's like a family tree. And within US Air, there were other consolidated, and all these little fiefdoms. And if you came from the Piedmont side and I came from the PSA side, then we kind of still hate each other, even though we now work for the same banner. So yeah, that's a huge source of friction, is trying to get cultures to merge like that.
Yeah, Tamar, in the investment banking side of things, what role would they play in that kind of merging and creating collaborative cultures?
Their whole thing is they come and they evaluate. There's a part of your balance sheets, it's called your synergies, which is kind of that value, extra value that acquiring X or merging with X company is going to be. And so what I find really interesting is an investment bank wants you to do an M&A transaction. That is, at the end of the day, what they're trying to do, whether it's good or not. But what's really interesting from their perspective is they are analyzing to whatever degree is the best way for a company to become better. Whether it be to raise capital, whether it be to merge with another company, just creating a better product at the end of the day is always the goal of one of these. And so what kind of gets curious to me, and actually something I'm really curious, is when we talk about private equity. That is kind of a secret monopoly in some words, that you can own a bunch of different companies and maybe they're not competing with each other, but they're competing with other people in the market and they have those back end of networks because they're all part of the same firm. So I am kind of curious on that and what that looks like for you guys.
I can certainly chime in on the private equity issue, and Carl, I'm sure, has things to add. Very concerning from the pro-enforcement, pro-consumer, pro-worker view that you're obviously hearing from me up here. Private equity is all about small acquisitions that kind of fly under the radar. Not every single merger is reportable to the feds, and a lot of stuff flies under the radar. And if you can develop a strategy to buy up very small companies in a market, it won't be too long before you have a really big market position. That's the model. They go in, they strip out costs, and send the profits to the bottom line and the shareholders, and then they're out. So turnaround times on private equity takeovers are really, what's the number now, Carl? Last year it was 5 to 7 years. I don't know what it is now. But the concern is we have private equity involvement in sectors that are really not cut out for the private equity model, and the most important one is healthcare. I just did a huge study looking at hospital acquisitions of independent physician practices, private equity acquisitions of independent physician practices. This is a train wreck, people. It is coming at you. We are losing our independent physicians. They are giving up the game. And private equity is coming in, and I have a lot of friends in Boulder, I live here, who are physicians who sold out to private equity. Not a good experience, and they have, and it raises prices of healthcare. So we're monitoring this very, very carefully. Again, no congressional interest, no congressional action. We're going to have to get Congress interested in these issues so that we can get sensible, pragmatic guardrail regulation in place to protect our markets and our consumers.
And speaking of private equity train wrecks, housing's another one where you had institutional private equity buying up tracts of homes, which then sort of took out capacity and arguably raised prices. What was so interesting is that even in this business-friendly administration, that pissed them off. And there was this move to restrict their ability to be a player in housing, which kind of is another difficult debate. I mean, they're a market buyer. Why should they be excluded? Well, I mean, then you're in a discussion about sort of negative societal externalities, and given our housing troubles, is it just making a bad situation worse? That's been really fascinating, I think.
This is a question I'll direct to Ellen, because I think it applies to not just antitrust, but also government corruption as a whole. These backroom deals between the White House and big business, is there precedent for that in American history?
Well, of course there is. But I would say that what we're seeing in this administration is unprecedented in the scope of it. It's, there's been self-dealing, obviously, in previous administrations, but what's going on, for example, in the crypto arena, where the president and his family opened up a business, and foreign potentates can now just put money in his pocket. I don't think we have seen that before. And we also have never seen a government where it was run by so many billionaires. I mean, if you just look at who's in the cabinet, these people are, there's the issue of self-dealing, and there's also the issue of representation, that, these people live on a different level than the rest of us, and they don't experience the kind of stressors that the rest of us do. There was, I'm going to forget which cabinet secretary it was, who said, well, my mother wouldn't care if her Social Security check was late. Well, sure, because you're a billionaire, and you can, if she runs out of money, she'll call you up and you'll help her out.
That was Lutnick.
That was Lutnick, okay. So, that's just not true for most of us, that, oh, gee, if my, paycheck, or if my Social Security check, if my, if the thing that I'm relying on to pay my rent and to buy my groceries, if that just didn't show up, oh, no problem. I got to say, I am privileged that I usually don't really look that closely at how much money it costs me to fill up my gas tank, but I have a minivan. It's got a big tank, and it was like completely empty when I rolled into the gas station last week, and I was shocked by how much money it costs to fill up the tank. So, I think the fact that there's the self-dealing aspect of people trying to enrich themselves and making government decisions that enrich them rather than are motivated by what is the best thing for the American people. But there's also just this disconnect between the reality that the people who are running our government live in and the way most other people in this country live.
My other favorite tone-deaf comment from a cabinet secretary in the last year was the Treasury Secretary was being challenged on one of the Sunday shows about inflation, and Bessent, he literally, I had to listen to it a few times, he literally said, well, one of the easiest ways to cut your cost of living is to move to a red state. And I remember thinking, okay, so I gotta sell my home, and pull my kids out of school, find a job, and moved, and then collect all the savings of all the red state, cost of living. So there is definitely, they've stepped on some rakes rhetorically in the last few years, and it does point to a disconnect between. I think it really. I mean, on one sense, it's like, okay, so they have $1 billion, so what? But it's a lifestyle, and it does explain. I don't know if you've seen, like, if you follow University of Michigan does consumer confidence every month. Like, the percentage of approval on government policy is at an all-time low, and it goes back to 52. So you're talking Watergate, the Cold War, 70s, price shock, .com, all those crises. It's now, you can argue about whether Michigan's methodology is accurate or whether it's a reflective poll, but something in there tells you that the Americans are not liking what they're hearing out of Washington.
Well, and I think it's a voting issue. For sure. I mean, the cost of living is probably more so than any other period in history is going to be the top of mind issue for folks as they go to the polls. And to bring it back to the topic of this panel, because I hear this all the time when I speak to skeptical audiences, that high prices aren't all about monopoly power or the fact that we have a beef packing cartel jacking up prices for beef at the grocery store, or that if American and United merge, boy, our airfares are going to go way up. It's not all about that, but let's be clear. There's a lot of economic evidence that shows that markups in the U.S. economy have skyrocketed over the last couple of decades. The markup is price over cost. That's where the market power is. If you have market power, you can jack up the price over cost. And so we have that bit of evidence, but then we also have inflation, which is just, upward pressure on price levels. We have supply chain disruptions, like during the pandemic and now with the Iran war. So there's a lot of factors, folks, that go into high prices. We cannot discount the role of high concentration, market power, upward pressure on prices for part of that overall increase in prices. That's why it's really important for us to enforce our antitrust laws in this country. And right now, they're really not being enforced because of all of this self-dealing and sweetheart deals, done in the back room at the White House. And we just lost the Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust at the DOJ, Gail Slater, because she really wanted to do the right thing. She wanted to bring cases, to prosecute cases independently, as the DOJ is designed to do. And her job description suddenly did not include that. It meant she had to take direction from the White House. So they fired her. And she's gone. And now she's back in the conversation, thank goodness, speaking out about what happened.
Diana, we talked in the green room about non-compete agreements and how they were handled by the previous FTC. We had an audience member ask about how they limit competition, but I'd be curious as well to hear how they can be, the best way that they would be implemented is restriction on non-competes. And what Lina Khan was doing.
Yeah, so this is a big labor market issue. One really cool development in the last 5 years is that we suddenly woke up as a country and said, wow, we have labor markets and workers are important to protect. And there's really two really just perniciously harmful things that go on. One is wage fixing, where employers gang up and they're like, okay, we're gonna fix wages at low levels. That pardon my French, really screws workers, reduces their earning potential and their earnings. The second one is these non-compete clauses in contracts. And some of you out there may well have signed non-compete clauses in labor contracts, which basically says, if you work for us, then you will not be able to work for any close competitor of ours, when you terminate your employment. Sometimes, and I'd be curious to hear other views on this, sometimes a non-compete clause can actually be justified, right? If you have highly skilled workers, super software developers in Silicon Valley who've been trained and there's been investment in training them and that patterns into value for the company. But what we saw were some cases alleging that companies like Jimmy John's and Taco Bell and McDonald's, don't quote me on those names, but in that category, they were forcing their employees to sign non-compete agreements. I mean, think about that. What special trade knowledge do you have? And believe me, I worked at my fair share of fast food restaurants when I was a teenager. But a non-compete agreement like that is completely unjustified. And what it does is it restricts labor mobility. It restricts people's ability to go work someplace else. So in our past administration, there was a very broad rulemaking to ban all non-competes, not just a portion of non-competes, but all of them. And there was quite a bit of controversy over that. We want to protect our workers, but we also don't want to go wildly overboard and put into place a law that would just be overkill in these labor markets.
Thanks, Dan. I'm going to combine a few questions here. With the way that antitrust laws are currently written, do they effectively address the issues with high market concentration in various different cases? And then in the cases of already high market concentration, and especially with private equity, how can these situations be undone? And anyone can answer that.
I'll take a really fast stab. I think our antitrust laws are good. I think they were written over 100 years ago. Clayton Act covers mergers. Sherman Act covers monopolies and anti-competitive conspiracies to restrain trade, to restrain commerce. Some of these laws, folks, are like 2 sentences long. And Congress wrote them that way for a reason, to maintain flexibility as markets changed, as technology changed. I mean, there was amazing foresight in Congress to write these laws in a way that would allow them to be flexible over time. And I think it really sort of, they've been very effective. The agencies over time have been really good at making adjustments in how they enforce the laws. The first line of defense is merger review, right? If you prevent harmful mergers, like Kroger-Albertsons, for example, then what you are doing is preventing the emergence of a dominant firm, right? A monopoly. If you can stop that merger, cut it off at the pass, you're preventing dominant firms, and you're preventing tight oligopolies of firms. This is what we worried about with all the airline mergers, right? United bought Continental, Delta bought Northwest. Now it's rumored that United and American have got a deal. JetBlue wanted to buy Spirit. That got shot down. All of that is prophylactic. It prevents concentration from happening before it happens. So merger enforcement, if you're looking for a really important area of antitrust law, is that. If you get that concentration in the dominant firms and the cartels, I just call them cartels, that's when we do have domestic cartels, for sure. It never used to be that way, but we have them now. But that's when other parts of the law really come into play in busting the monopolies and busting the anti-competitive agreements.
I would totally back up the Sherman Act stuff. I mean, it's hard to. They really were wise, and they knew that the economy was going to change in ways that even they could not imagine. So they left it a little mushy. And I sometimes think that as our Congresses have moved into the modern age, that it's just a matter of trying to get back at the other side, and you end up with these incredible policy swings on trade and antitrust, and everything gets personalized. But you do have to hand it to some of the early Congresses in the late 1800s, where they were like, we don't know what the future's going to bring. Let's give them a framework where both sides can argue their case in an environment that we literally can't see or envision.
But if I can interject, that all assumes that you're going to have neutral and expert people in the government who are going to be making these decisions, both deciding which entities need to be prosecuted, and then making the substantive decisions on whether the monopoly exists or not. And one of the things that we've seen in this administration, and this is being enhanced by the Supreme Court, what used to be a fringe legal theory of the unitary executive has suddenly taken over, and the Supreme Court seems to be on the verge of endorsing this notion that it's a little bit personal for me that the president can fire anybody he wants to, and he issued an executive order early on in his administration basically saying every single part of the federal government has to, whatever policy decisions they're making have to be dictated by the president and the attorney general when they're legal analyses. And, that was, we've had an administrative state for about 100 years, and I think personally that having independent agencies is actually a strength of government and makes government more neutral and more fair. And between this administration and the Supreme Court, which of course was influenced by this president heavily in his appointments, and he may be about to get yet another one, this is a real sea change in how government works and who makes decisions and who they represent.
We've discussed the limited resources of regulatory agencies, and I'm curious, looking beyond the U.S., we've seen in jurisdictions like the EU, for example, cracking down on Apple's using USB-C. And so what are the implications of potentially other regulatory agencies in other countries and the implications for American consumers?
It's a great point. I wanted to touch on that earlier, and that is that, these giants that arguably pose market risk are global. And so even if we don't keep them in check as well as we could, other countries do, and the EU is certainly one where they have different notions of what competition means and what competition is. They're more than happy, even if it's not punitive from a behavioral standpoint, they'll collect a handsome fee. I mean, it's kind of a joke on the street that it's a parking ticket, but you can count up the number of dollars or euros that Facebook and some of the other giants have had to pay over there, and it's probably a net benefit for global commerce that other countries and unions have different views about than we do at the moment.
Another kind of international question is looking at, with the context of the Iranian war and the Trump administration's foreign policy, how does this affect the global oil cartels, and how will that flow through the U.S. economy?
Well, I mean, I can try that. Obviously, what's going on in the Middle East is creating an enormous supply chain disruption, right? The U.S. does bring in oil that comes in part through the Straits of Hormuz. I think it's like 20%, 30%, something like that. We're a huge oil producer, right? We export a lot of oil. We export a lot of natural gas. So the supply chain disruption is wreaking havoc, especially in very Middle East dependent countries. China, I think, is suffering badly. So, we want to keep an eye on those supply chains, because whenever supply chains start constricting, there's always room for mischief, right? We saw that a lot during the COVID pandemic. Remember when there was no beef in the grocery stores because the JBS plants went down? Because everybody was sick and they couldn't get people to report to the meatpacking facilities. That was a colossal failure in a supply chain that reverberated throughout, all the way up to the ranchers, all the way down to the grocery stores and the kitchen tables. Same thing is happening with the oil markets. I will say, as compared to beef supply chains, the oil markets are pretty well functioning, and they're, Carl will have something to say on this, they're pretty resilient, and there's a lot of reallocation of supply and sort of filling in where there's gaps and constraints. But nonetheless, because it's a global market, we are feeling the effects of a very, very significant supply constraint, and it's taken a huge chunk out of everybody's monthly paycheck.
We haven't even really begun to understand the ripple effects that are going to come from this supply crunch, even if the ceasefire holds today and all hostilities end. My favorite theory in the moment is that because so much fertilizer moves through the strait and so many U.S. farmers won't get delivery on the fertilizer that they bought already for this planting season, that because there'll be a shortage of fertilizer, which means corn yields will come down, which means farmers won't be able to feed their cattle. So rather than feed them, it's too expensive, they will cull the herd, send the cattle to slaughter, which will create a temporary bump in beef supply. So you might actually see ground beef prices drop. Really weird tail things that are going to flutter around in the economy, and it's going to take many quarters and maybe years to understand just what a big deal this was.
So just to add on to Carl's good example about knock-on effects, look at the soybeans. So Trump implemented all the IEEPA tariffs under the emergency authority that he thinks he has, and the Chinese decided to retaliate, and they stopped buying soybeans from American farmers. I cannot tell you how many farmers I have spoken to over the last 6 months who have soybeans rotting in grain elevators. Almost the entire U.S. crop, the market was erased as a result of those tariffs. That will affect the growing season and the export markets for years to come. The damage is eye-popping. It's not like, oh, a blip, this happened this year. It's going to affect our growers in the United States, our soybean farmers, our corn farmers, our wheat farmers. It's going to affect everybody for years to come.
And then we could go on and on. What it means for John Deere's profits and employment and the workers who get laid off from a John Deere factory, and what happens to whether or not they can pay for their kids' college. I mean, the echoes are, it's like a hall of mirrors.
And I'd also want to just throw in that when it comes to the international economy, this is one place where, usually down on the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court's decision on tariffs has at least put some kind of a brake on the president's ability to stop folks like at the EU from trying to regulate the tech industry and stop, he was trying to play favorites and try and interfere with foreign governments' attempts to regulate various industries, and he's going to be very much hamstrung as a result of this Supreme Court opinion. So they got something right.
Yeah, when it comes to international competition, and I think a big example of that in terms of restricting international competition is electric vehicles in the U.S. So how, in theory, if the U.S. were to open up the market, would that help consumers in the long run, or would it make the U.S. largely uncompetitive?
EVs are a really, it's almost, it's like a movie. So we turned our back on EVs, obviously, policy-wise. All the big automakers had to turn tail on their EV development plans, took massive $1 billion, $50 billion write-downs on the reversal of that policy, and then we go to war in the Middle East, and oil goes to 140, and we're like, wait a minute! So it just really ridiculous whipsaw policy. And just, you can put yourself in the mind of a business leader who has a long cycle business, right? So you're making decisions on investments that you're not going to see the payoff for 3, maybe 5 years. Are you really going to make that call knowing what could change in November, in 2028? That's what's hamstrung a lot of this, would-be era of manufacturing, and the whole promise of the campaign was to bring, and which is a noble goal, to bring back manufacturing employment is down from the beginning of Trump 2.0. Despite all of the promises about screwing in little screws and turning Harvard into a trade school, and it's the volatility of policy it's funny because the president has run a business and he understands business cycles, but it's almost as if he purposely forgot what it takes to make long cycle investment decisions.
But the long cycle investment decisions, which is a core plank in Project 2025, just go read Project 2025. It's easy to find on the internet. It'll pop up everywhere. If you read that particular section, implementing the goal of onshoring U.S. manufacturing, and by the way, manufacturing is one of our most stagnant sectors. But why? Because the U.S. is a service economy, and we are a leader in innovation. We have gotten to that point of incredible dynamism and productivity because of that. We're not a manufacturing economy anymore. And guess what? We're never going to be one again. But that's what is going on right now politically, is to onshore all this manufacturing. And I got to say, Wall Street and business must be just snickering away, saying, okay, well, what concessions can we make? Of course, we're not going to build huge factories in the U.S. They'll take years to build, and Trump will be out of office by then. So no, we're not going to, we're going to find a way to work around those the requirements. So the whole thing is sort of I'm not saying that we shouldn't onshore some manufacturing, but the scale at which it is contemplated in Project 2025 is really mind-bending.
So we've got about 6 minutes remaining. I'll ask that each of our panelists give their closing remarks and also something that you're optimistic about in the world of antitrust.
Okay. I feel, and something we didn't exactly talk about today that I think is really interesting and curious to see the future of is something like the Rural Electrification Act, where monopolies, because there's such heavy capital expenditures in this world where a company will not go into a market unless they can have a monopoly. So I think there's a decrease of that because a lot of those CapEx investments, though they exist, they're kind of concrete, but I'm interested to see the world as we try to consolidate, but with AI, you can build a company more easily now. It's much easier for someone like me as a student to go have a startup because I have someone who can help me with the legal advice. So I'm curious to see, when we're talking about competition, that effect of AI to someone who's trying to start, I can get over those hurdles that maybe someone 10 years ago couldn't.
Yeah, I think I've said it all. I would just close by saying I have actually enormous hope and confidence that consumers will start voting with their dollars. Consumers and workers, I spent a lot of my time talking to them, really are very savvy now about the importance of competition. And these big antitrust cases that are floating through the news, they're following those. And they know that it hits them in their pocketbooks and paychecks. And when they pulled Jimmy Kimmel off the news because he made a comment about Charlie Kirk and Tegna or Nexstar, whichever one of them pulled Jimmy Kimmel off, an affiliate, advertisers headed for the door. And consumers dumped their cable subscriptions. We need more of that. Right? Consumers they know what choice is, they know how important it is, and so do workers. They know that a Kroger-Albertsons merger would have removed 50% of the employment opportunities for them in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where both retail grocers competed. So I have great confidence that workers and consumers are going to start voting with their feet and with their dollars.
I totally agree with Tamar's point about being an entrepreneur. AI is going to change a lot. We have had some venture capital guys on the air lately, and who are experts at sort of judging slide decks from entrepreneurs with their business plans, and the efficiency of you can start a software business with just a couple of guys, and that's going to be hugely liberating, I think, for business growth, small business growth. I guess one thing I would say is I think about NVIDIA sometimes. You probably are familiar with NVIDIA, very famous, biggest market cap company in the world, and it's been benefits anybody who bought in the past few years. But even with their 90% margins, other players like AMD and Intel have found ways to chip. They always say one man's margin is another man's opportunity. And even as big as NVIDIA is and as many important things as it brought to the world, the stock's been dead money for almost a year. And that's the market sort of sniffing out the next thing. The great thing about our economy is we are always thinking about the next thing. And we just don't get sclerotic. It's a blessing.
I want to largely echo what Diana said, that I think the election's going to have a big impact. I think we're going to see huge turnout in this election. I'm inspired by what happened in Hungary in terms of turnout, almost 80% turnout. We've never had anything like that here in this country. Maybe this will be our year. But the administration is trying to implement a pay-to-play world, and and many industries are all too happy to say, okay, we can be transactional, we're willing to play that game, but at the end of the day, it is the American people, it is the voters who are going to determine the shape of our government and its policies, and I ultimately have faith in the American people.
All right, that is the conclusion of our panel. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Please give it up for our panelists.
I wanted to ask you where you were when you first got the news about your